su questo. Qualche passo lo stiamo facendo, qualche piccolo passo, ma penso che sia molto importante e penso che questo farlo e che se questa serie di lezioni che mettono in campo un punto di vista complementare, quello di progettisti che si misurano da tempo su questi sui temi legati al paesaggio, ma anche quello di studiosi che non hanno mai cessato di comprendere il paesaggio, di comprenderne le dinamiche, anche quando paesaggi o città sembrano non cambiati o non particolarmente cambiati. E questo è un tema per noi di grande interesse, perché la questione progettuale, la questione dell'analisi, che si tratti di città o che si tratti di paesaggio, è qualcosa di fondante e di caratteristico della nostra università, il mettere assieme un'attenzione continua ad alcune questioni, ad alcuni meccanismi e la capacità di intervenire in queste questioni. E poi penso che forse un riaffermare l'interesse della nostra università su questi temi, pur nella situazione anche per molti versi drammatica che stiamo vivendo, abbia un preciso senso in questo momento, che è un momento di cambiamento, comunque sia, un momento di cambiamento profondo. È un momento in cui siamo stati costretti nei mesi scorsi a guardare fissamente e a vivere con fissità luoghi, spazi, paesaggi. E per molti versi ci siamo resi conto, come sempre avviene quando lo sguardo diventa fisso o è costretto ad essere fisso, ci siamo anche accorti di una serie di cambiamenti importanti che i luoghi in cui viviamo o i luoghi in cui studiamo hanno conosciuto. Questo determina, credo, una necessità da parte nostra di adeguamento dei nostri punti di vista e dei nostri strumenti, inevitabilmente. Cioè questo diventa una questione fondamentale. Non possiamo più procedere per luoghi comuni, per presupposti, dobbiamo fare i conti con una realtà che abbiamo osservato con sguardo continuo e rispetto alla quale siamo andati oltre, abbiamo avuto la possibilità di andare oltre alla superficie delle cose, per guardare quello che realmente stava succedendo. Allora in questo momento credo sia particolarmente importante dichiarare anche la volontà, anche attraverso i vostri interventi, i vostri punti di vista di studiosi e di progettisti, di riattivare questo genere di attenzione. E per quanto è possibile di riprendere da parte nostra, che indubbiamente negli ultimi anni abbiamo un po' allentato l'interesse sui temi del paesaggio, o l'abbiamo frammentato, frantumato in tanti rivoli, di riprenderlo. E questo è un po' un impegno che ci prendiamo, per quanto mi rimane da svolgere questo lavoro, mi prendo, e appunto è che sono particolarmente contento che abbia la possibilità di avere, come è successo e come sta succedendo anche con Sto, dei compagni di strada, degli aiuti da questo punto di vista, e da parte vostra, Sandro, Linda e tutti quelli che parteciperanno a queste conferenze, dei punti di vista sfaccettati e attenti e sapienti su questo tema, che è un tema di fondamentale interesse per noi. Grazie quindi a voi, e credo che forse Renato introdurrà poi la vostra conferenza.
Mi devi lanciare, però non continuiamo.
Grazie Alberto.
Facciamo.
Grazie Alberto Ferlenga, il nostro rettore, che ha introdotto già un po' la tematica di questo ciclo. Adesso a me spetta, continuo un pochino con l'italiano, poi magari passerò all'inglese, così alterniamo un po' le questioni. Vedo di lanciare un piccolo PowerPoint, eccolo qua, spero che lo vediate. Vedete?
Sì.
Sì, si vede. Innanzitutto appunto ci necessita di ringraziare moltissimo, come sempre, la Sto Stiftung, che la fondazione Sto, che ci ha aiutato e che collabora con noi per organizzare anche quest'anno questi November Talks, purtroppo in una condizione molto più difficile, ma ci auguriamo che tutto possa comunque procedere. Come vedete dal calendario che potete vedere nel manifesto, sono 5 appuntamenti. Oggi siamo di mercoledì, però nelle prossime puntate passeremo al martedì pomeriggio, sempre alle 17. Avremo in successione, oltre a Sandro Marpillero e Linda Pollak che oggi interverranno, Iñaki Ábalos e Renata Senkiewicz da Madrid il 3 di novembre, il 17 di novembre John Roch dello studio Bagli Roch di Barcellona, e poi il 24 di novembre Juan Manuel Palermo, vecchio nostro amico e collega, oltretutto presidente di Uniscape, l'associazione che cura le questioni dell'università in relazione con la Convenzione europea del paesaggio, e che è uno dei motivi, come ha detto anche prima Alberto Ferlenga, che ci ha condotto quest'anno a ragionare sul rapporto tra l'architettura e il paesaggio come tematica principale. E infine avremo il 1° dicembre Ralf Ramstad, architetto norvegese, che peraltro si è laureato nella nostra università alcuni anni addietro, è diventato un personaggio di grande spicco dell'architettura norvegese, e che anche lui ha un rapporto col paesaggio molto intenso. Questo è il programma di quest'anno che oggi avviamo, ma prima di cominciare vorrei anche richiamare un po' l'esperienza dello scorso anno, che siamo riusciti fortunatamente a raccogliere in un piccolo volume che è uscito presso Mimesis, l'editore di Milano e Udine, di cui vedete la copertina, e che raccoglie in forma di interviste la serie delle conferenze e dei talks che abbiamo fatto l'anno scorso, il cui tema appunto era l'architettura e l'esperienza dello spazio. Vi mostro in rapida sintesi il frontespizio, la dedica in memoria di Enrico Fontanari di questo libro che abbiamo ritenuto di dover fare, perché il libro era in stampa quando purtroppo Enrico ci ha lasciato, con grande disappunto di tutti noi, in una maniera assolutamente improvvisa, e quindi è un modo per richiamare, come già ha fatto il rettore, la sua memoria e il suo contributo eccezionale per questa università negli scambi internazionali di cui è stato il fautore per molti anni. L'indice del libro, che è bilingue in italiano e in inglese, riproduce appunto le 5 conferenze dello scorso anno, che vedevano impegnati Guillermo Hevia Garcia dal Cile, giovanissimo architetto molto rampante, che sta avendo un grande successo internazionale, a cui è seguito poi Maruša Zorec, nostra collega ed amica di Lubiana, slovena, e poi Carme Pinós, famosa architetta catalana, e infine Manuel Aires Mateus per il Portogallo, e di nuovo un laureato Iuav che si è distinto per brillanti carriere, che è Fabrizio Barozzi dello studio Barozzi Veiga, che aveva concluso l'anno scorso il ciclo. Il libro è introdotto dal nostro rettore, come oggi ha fatto per il nuovo ciclo, e c'è una breve introduzione da parte mia che avrete modo eventualmente di leggere, e poi appunto questa serie di interventi che sono stati tradotti in interviste, che però riproducono praticamente le tematiche dei 5 talks. Questo è Guillermo Hevia e alcuni dei suoi progetti che potrete ritrovare nel libro. Questa è Marusha Zorec e una selezione dei suoi progetti presentati, Carme Pinos e Manuel Mateus, ben noto a tutti voi, e infine Fabrizio Barozzi in questo intervento intitolato Risonanze, che concludeva il ciclo. Il libro poi contiene ovviamente tutte le operazioni, le notazioni biografiche di questi 5 autori, e mi auguro che questo libro possa essere un ritorno sulle esperienze dell'anno scorso. Dimenticavo di dire che, come vedete, questi QR code consentono di risentire le registrazioni non eccezionali dal punto di vista della qualità video, però utili per chi volesse riascoltare quelle conferenze, perché siete in grado attraverso il libro di poterle recuperare direttamente in rete. Questo così accenno soltanto a favore di Linda in inglese, only very few words to recover the theme we met in these talks. The interest was for a dimension of architectural space which takes in account the results in terms of perception and life impact, which is a common ground of the 5 experiences presented by the 5 invited architects. This interest is declined in Guillermo Hevia into the production of flexible spaces with a strong emotional impact. Marusha Zorec works through a patient myotic attention on heritage buildings in particular. Karma Pinos works overall on the relationship between architecture and everyday life, and this was the theme of her intervention. And Manuel Mateus, of course, proposes a research on the dialogue between space and matter, as we know very well. And Fabrizio Barozzi highlights the relationship between architecture and place. Fabrizio Barozzi in this moment is working also in the States, in Chicago, for the Art Institute of Chicago, and we are very interested to see what would be this new experience in the States. Coming to the new cycle we are presenting today, I can simply read the brief I reproduced here. The landscape in the foreground today on the contemporary scene is a new landscape which must deal with the rapid territorial change, with the serious problems of resource consumption, climate change, economic crisis, and which, however, cannot and must not forget the themes of history, of memory, and above all of culture, material and non-material, on which even new landscapes can and must be reconfigured. Overwriting the landscape palimpsest is inevitable to affirm a serious design culture towards that perception of population or people to which the European Landscape Convention refers. The ways of this overwriting are to be found in a rich and profound interdisciplinary dialogue and in the refundation that can derive from this for the design disciplines. The relational character and the centrality. What is? It's more emphatic. And so the relational character and the centrality of time and movement factors in the landscape project connect architectural research to a stream of interests closely linked to aesthetic, philosophical, and scientific thinking, traceable above all in the field of the phenomenology of perception and non-Euclidean geometries, as well as the experiments of the arts linked to the concepts of motion, emotion, from cinema to dance, from visual arts to various performing arts up to environmental art. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the signing in Florence of the European Landscape Convention, the November talks of this year at the Iuav University of Venice aim to offer contribution to the debate around the relationship that contemporary architecture has often tried to establish with the figurative, spatial, and topographical aspects of landscape, as well as with its characteristics of dynamically changing perception, also developing on the other hand an evident interest in ecological problems. This attitude has fostered a frequent and rich dialogue between architects, landscape architects, and environmental artists in attempt to compare and combine the tools of the architectural design with those of the landscape design and in the environmental art. The 5 architects invited for the cycle of talks this year are chosen from the wide range of important contemporary architects whose research has developed the theme of new landscapes in original and peculiar ways, to the point of profoundly connoting their design responses according to this influence. E quindi possiamo vedere qui in sequenza le immagini dei relatori che ascolteremo in questo ciclo, e con questo io ho concluso questa breve introduzione. Scusate se per rapidità ho letto semplicemente il brief e credo che a questo punto possiamo ascoltare, per non perdere altro tempo, i nostri amici americani, italo-americani, Sandro Marpillero and Linda Pollak. We are very glad to have you virtually here with us, and so you can speak of your works, and so I hope we can have a little debate after, and I invited our guests to prepare eventually some questions or observations. Thank you. A voi la parola, Sandro.
Okay. Thank you very much, Renato. Thank you very much, Professor Alberto Perlenga, for his general introduction. And obviously, thank you very much to the Stiftung organization for setting up this opportunity to share some aspects of our work. Obviously, Professor Bocchi, as the organizer and the force behind this November talks, is carrying on a commitment that we know it has been pursuing and developing over many years. This is an opportunity for us, and I think that what we decided to do was actually to focus on one project in order to be able to go in depth with that. But maybe Linda wants to say a couple of words, both as introduction and as welcoming.
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Renato. And it's an honor to be part of these talks. And Sandro's going to kind of lay out the bigger picture. We're going to be talking about Queens Plaza Bicycle and Pedestrian Improvements Project. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
So what we're going to do now, we're going to move the screen so that each of us presents in a direct way. We're going to do it like this. I'm going to share the screen. Screen share. This is it. And this is the beginning of our presentation. The title of our presentation is Environmental Apparatuses. We use the plural because we're going to see the complexity of the situations that we have engaged, although we're going to talk essentially about one project within which there are multiple opportunities to develop this notion of apparatus. As Linda said, we're going to talk about our project for Queens Plaza. You see here a plan that locates Queens Plaza in relationship to Manhattan, and I'll go further into that in a minute. But this slide introduces the agencies, the main agencies that were involved in the development of this project. It is a public project, of course, and it was sponsored by the Economic Development Corporation, which is a parallel arm of the city that oversees larger projects related to investment opportunity and improvement of the quality, as it has been an agenda of the previous administration in particular that has launched a number of these initiatives. Given the scale of the project, the Department of City Planning has had a fundamental role, and I will talk at the beginning about our conversation with them and the tools that we have developed, and obviously the Department of Park and Recreation, since we're dealing with a park. We have a situation in Queens Plaza, which is, as you can see in this existing condition, particularly tough due to both the presence of traffic and the presence of elevated subway infrastructure that dominate the space. The agenda of the project is, on the one hand, to engage the elevated, and on the other hand, also to introduce, in relationship to that, a new notion of public space and park. I will go now to what is a general framework that qualifies our use of the word apparatus, and this diagram simply juxtaposes a logic of tectonics in terms of the modernist object versus the environmental apparatus. You will read it horizontally in lines in terms of the reference of tectonics and paradigms, constructs, and projections, having the columns setting up a comparison between these two frameworks. So as opposed to focus only on engineering, an approach towards the environmental apparatus refers to a tradition of tectonics that goes back to Gottfried Semper, and the notion that architecture is related with textile and the art of weaving. In that sense, the inflection that we want to introduce with this project is also to engage aspects of labor in terms of the notion of both constructing ground and infrastructure, and anthropology because of the diversity of publics that we are engaging. So in terms of a modernist lineage, the pastoral landscape has been, especially in New York with Central Park, the complement to a certain notion of development of the city in terms of its potential to redeem to a certain degree the toughness of living in the city. In opposition to that, we are more interested in engaging, as you see in the diagram below that, in environmental flows, acknowledging, in other words, that there are multiple logics, there are multiple scales and reaches of the different flows, whereby a project activates these flows and acts as a filter in order to engage them in productive terms. In terms of the constructs, that you see the third column, as opposed to focusing on the position of objects on field, which corresponds in urban design terms to the juxtaposition between a figure and ground, we are going to focus on the notion of a relationship between ground and boundary in terms of the paradoxical thresholds and conditions of productive tensions between these two approaches, as opposed to using the digital manipulations to extend the object. We are interested in using that instead in order to acknowledge the role of time and the role of the tools that provide opportunities to talk about a different level of complexity and therefore a certain opening towards chance. Here you will see in relationship with the environmental apparatus parameters, some aspects of the project that we're going to present in terms of the engagement of multiple flows at the level of the overall project, the focus on environmental flows in setting up a way of approaching the project that is not through master planning, focus on the ground and on the elevated as two complementary aspects, and opening up the notion again of master plan by both having a strategic use of these elements and pursuing a level of visceral engagement. So in order to position quickly Queen's Plaza in terms of its historical context, it is interesting that the British headquarters map of 1782 was clearly focusing on the presence of elevated spaces because it was a military map, and therefore the positioning of guns and control of the territory. Notice that the area of Long Island City was characterized by two ridges and a number of wetlands that in part remain. The impact of the commissioner's plan of 1811 is, first of all, focused on Manhattan alone, and secondly, was setting up a use of the terrain. You see that in the map, there's not even yet the presence of Central Park, so it is the logic of the blocks in terms of the maximizing of development in terms of the individuality of the blocks themselves. So looking at that, I think that extracting Queen's Plaza from the historical context and giving it a unique identity is the goal of allowing to relate Queen's Plaza to Manhattan and put it in perspective in relationship to Central Park. This is an important stance in terms of a postmodern condition, if you want, and a condition whereby the dialogue between the use of landscape and the city is able to engage a dimension of infrastructure. You see here a view, as I said, from Queens Plaza, and you see the fact that there is actually a direct infrastructural connection between this space and the edge of Central Park. And therefore, the dialogue between the pastoralism of Central Park and this new notion of environmental apparatus in the context of what used to be called the inner periphery of the city is what this project, to a certain degree, will try to make clear. In terms of these connections between Queens Plaza and the city, you see here an image of 1909, which is when the Queensboro Bridge that you see at the end, a little bit in the fog, was built, literally establishing a connection. What's interesting is that it was built from the beginning as a two-tier bridge. In other words, there was a level for traffic and a level for trolleys that, as you can see in this image, were reaching Queens Plaza, therefore engaging this portion of the city, not only in terms of traffic, but also in terms of the setup of a certain commuting development that the presence of the trolleys facilitated. In 2001, the Department of City Planning identified a specific area that was reaching Queens Plaza, somehow incorporating and acknowledging the fact that at the time one building had been built. It was the Tower of Citicorp. The reason why it was built like that is because there is a direct subway connection between literally the Citicorp in Midtown and this location, which therefore made this building literally an extension of the logic of Manhattan in Queens. On the basis of this setup, the Department of City Planning began to study possible development of massing that you see here in this study, which were accompanied not only by a focus on what happened after 9/11, which was the notion of creating metropolitan centers, therefore to have a decentralization within the larger context of what otherwise would have been an excessive concentration and therefore causes of vulnerability. So in this case, you see that Queens Plaza was identified as one of the possible areas of metropolitan center, while the city planning was already considering development along the edge. This building in particular was not built. Something more substantial has been already built further south in what was called at the time Queens West. The sequence of aerial gives you a sense of the situation in 2004 when we were engaged in the project for the first time. What happened by the time in 2012, our project that you see identified by the vegetation underneath the elevated had been built, and at the same time on the lower left you see the shadow of the first tower development that happened on Queens Plaza South, and it is the Gotham Center development. This was the first one of an incredibly accelerated process that followed this, which has brought a condition, as you can see here, of last year of quite a number of tall buildings overlooking the space that we have created, and with more under construction. In fact, this diagram of 2016 indicates a number of buildings as proposed, and 2 of them have already been built, and another couple of them are already in construction. To give you a sense of the experience of the site as one approaches it from the elevated subway, we have this short video that starts from Ford Square. And moves already looking at the development further south around the Citicorp building. But as you can see every street there is the appearance of a number of new developments. So you can see that at some point there is going to be a reflection of what used to be the only five signs that mark the presence of Silvercup Studios, while you're seeing just now the ramp of traffic that reaches Queensboro Bridge, that in the meantime you see the Silvercup Studios right here reflected in the circle road. And this is one of the historical buildings around which the elevator that comes from the south turns 90 degrees and eventually reaches the station of Queensboro Plaza, which is one of the two subway connections that converge on this particular site. You see a building under construction down there, and you see this that is literally at the moment of being completed. So, as I said, in 2001, there was a rezoning exercise on the part of the Department of City Planning, while the issue of Queens Plaza had been partially engaged with an idea competition sponsored by the Van Allen Institute. At the same time, probably the main problem of the area, which was traffic and the use of that space at the base of the elevated for parking, was redefined in terms of a traffic study. Obviously, this traffic study, as you see, had indicated as generic green the area that eventually became part of the project. We entered the scene in relationship with the Department of City Planning and the rezoning of Long Island City in general, working with a large landscape firm, WRT, but taking on an interesting role, which was the one of both urban designers and architects. In other words, we position ourselves, although we are obviously a smaller firm rather than a large corporate firm, in the position of basically bracketing their work, both in terms of the conceptual setup, you see on the right our approach, and in terms of architecture, which is focused on a closer understanding of the slight topographical variations that exist in the site, which in fact reconnect back with the early map of the headquarters map rather than the leveling of the city, which has been implicit in the commissioner map of Manhattan that has become obviously a model for the development of the city and its own suburbs as well. So at this point, because we wanted to focus on the issue of the elevated, which is managed by the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which is a state agency as opposed to a city agencies, the dialogue expanded in that direction. And also in terms of our direct connections, the setup of collaborating with Michael Singer as the artist for the site was complemented with the participation of a number of structural engineers that allowed to study very closely the way in which this incredible piece of infrastructure had been built and how to pursue this level of integration. The interesting thing about New York is that the Department of Traffic is the one that owns the land. In other words, all the streets are controlled by a different agency, which is a city agency, and how this agency therefore sets up a number of standards for lighting, for the way in which the edge of the sidewalks are set up, and not only that, but obviously coordinates all the traffic and the public transportation. This process included what was called then the New York City Art Commission, which is basically an agency within the city that has the task of approving essentially every public project and therefore exerts a certain level of control on the civic quality of what gets to be done. In the case of a landscape, of course, the Department of Parks and Recreation entered to a certain degree later on into the picture. Of course, we had had dialogues with them before, but in terms of setting up essentially the maintenance regime and the standards for maintenance of a space like this, which are specific to the way in which the overall system of parks is managed within the city. So to go back to our approach, our critique of a conventional master plan, you could say, conceptually refers to two references. On the one hand, the work of environmental sculptors, and here I show what is called a photo drawing by Mary Miss, and you see it is a collage in which the effect of attraction of this well in Egypt is intensified by the multiplication of prints. And on the other hand, complementary to that level of visceral engagement that we wanted to maintain in a site so complex, is in fact a different notion of score, a different notion of composition, a different notion of music. So the reference to the open-ended organization of the concert for piano and orchestra of John Cage, which is made of multiple sheets that can be rearranged in a different order and therefore allow different players to interpret the score in a different way. These two components are somehow joined in the collage on the right side that also includes a fragment of the plan, and it is a collage at the moment in which the Queensboro Bridge lands on the terrain, while at the same time one of the lines of the elevated subway emerges from underneath the river and begins to climb in order to reach the level of the station. So as you can imagine, this project, which is 1.25 miles long, stretches all the way from the river and therefore the anchorage of the bridge, creating this condition midway of elevated infrastructure and station, and eventually reaching with the viaduct the other side of the sort of stretch of this project. Now, what has been focused on for the phase one, which is what we're going to talk about, is the area specifically around Queens Plaza, which is the point at which the elevated infrastructure was separated. The approach has been, as I said, focused on engaging environmental flows, and we were lucky enough to work with Battle McCarthy engineers, which had already developed a number of considerations on how to engage light, sun, and noise. So we set up essentially a number of plans that engage the urban design, the environmental, and the structure and light conditions through the construction of apparatuses. In other words, by focusing on the operational aspect, the smaller intervention could produce and resonate at a larger scale. On the basis of this system of somehow thematic organization vertically and somehow specific operations organized horizontally, this notion of apparatus became a way to subvert the logic of master plan and instead produce essentially a number of scores, like musical scores, as you can see here, operating along those three registers. So there is an urban design register that addresses pedestrian transportation, seating, and wayfinding. There is another register that engages environmental flows in terms of stored water, wind and sun, and noise control, and inevitably another register that engages the issue of structure and lighting, understanding the construction models of the elevated, which is very important, the distribution of light, and eventually the use of color. As you can see here, this is an example of a portion in the medians, precisely midway before arriving to Queens Plaza. Some of the notions of vertical screen and flowing banks, you will see, got to be eventually reconsidered and revisited, for example, in terms of the engagement of the elevated, in terms of, the construction models and so forth, in terms of the lighting, and in terms of the flowing bench, which has to do with the integration of stormwater management on the sitting arrangements that we have developed together with Michael Singer. So the way in which we approached the project was to maintain the logic of the diagram as a way to allow different actors, since the project is fairly complex in terms of the convergence of public and private interests, to see the concept essentially, rather than necessarily presenting it as it usually is in terms of views and perspective. Obviously, this is also part of the presentation, but the strategy of moving towards a more open-ended logic of performances as opposed to zoning and master planning with an indefinite goal of implementation is precisely to offer tools for different kind of interventions and different kind of thought, and at the same time, therefore, developing the notion of apparatus in a multiplicity of directions, such that the diversity that is already implicit in the stretch of the plan, but also in the diversity of the flows that we wanted to engage, can be fully expanded. This is another example in which the environmental flows in terms of the stormwater management converge at Dutch Kills Green, which is the new name of the main space at Queen's Plaza, in terms of the creation of a wetland filtration system towards which basically the slope of the ground allows the water to converge and eventually to be filtered in a space that eventually belongs to a system which, in the case of New York, is very important insofar as it limits the convergence of gray water and sewer water, which causes, in the case of New York, an overflow of the system and a problem, therefore, of pollution of the water river. And so, as you know, techniques to delay the dispersal of the water into the system, as this wetland does, are very important. So the interesting thing, and I will pass the voice to Linda at this moment, is that, for example, in this photo, you see that same wetland area in which this person is venturing in. And I would like to note, as a side note, that one of the amazing things that this particular portion of the landscape produced was the presence of butterflies, which were really unexpected in relation to the kind of aggressiveness of the site, the presence of infrastructure, and the elevated, to which I will return soon. I will move the screen. Linda?
Okay, thank you. So Sandro has been speaking about the operations of the site and the project at multiple urban scales. My goal is to speak about these operations at a granular scale, because that's where a lot of the project happens. Also, Sandro spoke about our firm being the architect and the urban designer, and our collaboration with engineers, with the landscapes architects, with the artists. I think because I also have a background in landscape, that collaboration with the landscape architect is made more productive. And I think you'll have a sense of it as I go along. So here we are in 2012, looking at the project phase 1 completion. And you get the feeling that there's a there, that this is a place for people, a place with landscape, a place that has places to walk and places to sit. And So here's that same site in 2009, a year before the construction started. And you can see that it's a sea of asphalt, and there's no planting and there's no water management, and it's pretty bleak. I mean, it's not really a place for people. The site has affordances in the term of J.J. Gibson, that the DCP, Department of City Planning's rezoning of the site was on the basis of its being a transportation hub. As we recall, the Queens Plaza, the view Sandro showed from 1909, didn't have any elevated subways in it. And the Queens Plaza was conceived as, and the park was conceived as a place that could develop into a neighborhood. The presence of the elevated subways that came soon after and that covered the width of the street for a long period, and now covers half the Queens Plaza South. Queens Plaza is the name of the street that then has Dutch Kills Green, the little park, as part of our project. That it wasn't intended to harbor so much subways, but now, of course, it does. The affordances of the site as a transportation hub with multiple bus lines, underground subway lines, above ground subway lines of the 7 and the N, and 16 lanes of car and truck traffic. Those affordances are also represent the challenges of the project. You can see in these views along the site, Sandro showed this image earlier, you can't look anywhere on the site without seeing the elevated. And so you have a sense it's not possible to make a pastoral landscape on this site, that there's no way landscape can be used as a band-aid, which it often has been. So it really requires a different approach. The site, is acres and acres of hard surfaces, impermeable surfaces. There's no shade, it's noisy, it's unwalkable. There are no pedestrians really, and it's basically unlivable. So the goals of the RFP were to make Queens Plaza walkable and bikeable, to reconnect the north and south portions of the city across the elevated structure, to attract mixed-use development and to retain the industrial character of the place. So here's this view. You can see there's a pedestrian, not a person trying to get across the street, but certainly it's not a place that situates pedestrians. And like I said, that same affordance of the site with all its potentials for movement by vehicles and subways and buses is what constitutes the challenges of the project. It's the widest street in New York City. And so how do we situate flows of pedestrians and cyclists alongside flows of buses and trucks and cars and subways? And you can see there's a picture of the project that shows that we did manage to do it and to situate these flows of pedestrians. This is showing the landscape project for the site that Sandro was discussing in terms of its systems. But you can see the area that the median, which runs down the center, which places cyclists and pedestrians at the center, kind of opens up to become what became Dutch Kills Green. And that beyond that, there's Sunnyside Yards. So the subway, the N subway turns north at this point, and the 7 subway goes across the viaduct. This is a train yard to the east that is not being where the land basically ends. So this is showing the site, an aerial of the site in 2004, what was called the JFK commuter triangle, and then showing our project in 2012. And I just do this overview as a kind of reference to situate you. And you can see, well, let me go on. So here's that, that aerial view. It's from the clock tower, looking towards the elevated subway across the commuter triangle. And then here is a collage that I made that overlaid the schematic design for the project onto the site with the elevated and whatever buildings were there. And I wanted to note that the importance of representing the site in 3 dimensions, that this is not a project that could be accomplished by thinking in plan. So I made this collage to enable Amanda Burden, the director of city planning, to enable her to be able to visualize the proposed project in a site visit that we made together, and that turned out to also be very useful, that collage, in helping move our thinking forward. So this slide could be called How to Construct an Environmental Apparatus. I called it Everything Matters. The idea that everything in the field matters, that there's nothing that could be additive in this project, that you can't like add amenities, that in order to accomplish the project, you need to acknowledge and represent and mobilize everything in the field to be an actor. Everything, the elevated, the sidewalk, the ground, the buildings, the stormwater, to enable each thing to play one or more roles. And so how to do that? How did we do that? What I'm going to try to explain is how we internally differentiate each thing to break down or break open its singular identity, such as the singular identity of a path or a sidewalk or a planter, to break down and break open the singular identity of each thing in support of constructing relationships with other things across conventional categories of identity. And this is in support of the idea of interweaving, was something Sandro addressed in the diagram of the environmental apparatus. But in this approach, there can be no fixed center. There can be no whole that leaves, there's no figure with a ground that becomes background. There's that each thing is a fragment in relation with other fragments. So making the ground matter. As Sandro touched on, part of the project was about thickening the ground at multiple scales, thickening it in a physical sense, a topographical sense, but also thickening it in the roles that it plays, thickening it to stand up to the elevated, to situate pedestrians and cyclists in an out of scale site, to handle stormwater, to provide acoustic separation between cars and drivers and pedestrians. So many roles that this thickening of the ground plays, and it also is a way of talking about what I usually talk about, which is constructing ground. We'll come back to that. But so this is a model, a sketch model I made in a moment of frustration of trying to communicate how the berms that separate the vehicular traffic, how they were not individual berms, steel-sided berms, but that they were part of that the landscape of the park, the topography of the park, and the landscape of these traffic separating berms was one landscape. So it's like one mound, and that it's one topography, and as such, it really takes on. And we were able to leverage this quality, it takes on the scale of earthwork. I think, or environmental art, just like portions of the elevated do in the transformations that Sandro is going to be speaking about. So to make these berms, to make this landscape that had to do with the vehicles, I've always been inspired by the steel curbs in industrial neighborhoods in New York, and the idea of being able to use these steel curbs, this artifact, the curb being the place where, you know, people and cars, where pedestrians and vehicular traffic meet, where the curb is a site in the city where a lot happens. It's a place where different systems interact. So here you can see one of the steel-sided berms, and of course, this is just mill finish steel, like quite thick, that was installed on the site, painted, but then with intentionally the paint comes off and it rusts. And you can see how this landscape is made to slope down to where people cross. So it's not, there's not a big wall next to pedestrians, but that it gets some height as it goes towards the middle. And then you can see we also use the steel-sided, a different way of making the steel-sided berms to situate planting in a way that would buffer cyclists and pedestrians against the many lanes of traffic. So the idea of internally differentiating the flows, so it's not like a sidewalk or a bike path, but so you can see here these 5 ways of navigating the park at Dutch Kills Green, in the shadow of the oak trees, climbing up the little hill that we call the paddle, along the main path, and then over the wetland and on the bridge. So by multiplying the flows of cyclists and pedestrians, we were able to layer those flows, those internally differentiated flows, alongside of truck and bus. Now, how the berm that's separating the traffic is part of the landscape of the park, notwithstanding the very wide roads between. But you can see how, as a pedestrian or cyclist, you can feel yourself moving in this east-west direction, more or less, alongside all these other flows. That there's no modernist separation of cars and people, because that wouldn't be possible in a site that's so dominated by transportation infrastructure. It's not the High Line, which is made with a decommissioned elevated infrastructure. Everything here is still operational. So situating flows, I was so happy to see this older man and his probably son or nephew or friend choosing on purpose to go up the paddle and then hop down the steps, that there was enough engaging here for them to choose that path that involves some physical activity, you know, like more than one of the other paths. But you can see here how the landscape insulates the car and truck traffic noise to enable pedestrians to be, you know, in their own space, alongside, layered with their flows layered alongside those of cars and trucks. And the cyclists, I think there's a sense of speed and movement as you move as a cyclist alongside the cars and trucks and the elevated trains that I think people feel. And the cycling has, increased like 10 times, 20 times what it was previously. You can stand there and you see a cyclist, every 3 seconds really now. Anyway, you can see coming off the bridge and coming through there. And you can see the relationships. This shows the berm before the paint came off. So then how to make seating and part of an environmental apparatus, how to make it be able to be situated in a site that's so harsh. And so the way, one part of how we did it was to internally differentiate seating. So it's not a park bench that's put here or there or in groups or in a line, that we differentiate and multiply the seating. So we have, well, we always have a 4-foot wide wooden portion of the bench. The bench could be 6 feet long or 10 feet long. The bench, and you can see in the second row of images, could have a solid base for being part of a topography of earth, or an open base to float over a portion of the wetland. You can see that it could have a back in the third row or no back. So this multiplicity enables the site furniture to play multiple roles. And you can see here the groups of the benches, including with the artist's paving, and how we made a limited intervention of these spaces. That we had the artist paving, which shows here alongside a simpler Hanover paver. But so this assemblage of benches that play multiple roles, each one becomes a place. And you can see how here that you have benches that make a planter, or benches that turn into sitting steps, or benches that stitch upland and lowland landscape across a main path. And these small images are taken from that aerial collage that I made, and they show how the benches, you know, can play multiple roles. That here the bench with the solid base is making a transition between the flat and the berm topography. In the second one, the benches across the two sides of the path stitched together upland and lowland landscapes. In the third, the benches become a planter. So they make a space for planting. So opening up the singular identity of the bench enables groupings or arrangements or assemblages of site furniture to perform multiple roles. And here's the completed project with the same, showing the same capacities of the bench. And you can see here on the lower right, loose groupings form the main space. The idea that there's no center, there's a main-ish space that enables kind of a more gathering if you wanted to be together of 25 or 30 people, if it wasn't during a pandemic, but that it's open to all the flows. Like I said, there's no holes that reduce things around them to being less important. So you can see here how the benches and the paving of the artist on the left then cross to the benches and the paving and the runnels that deal with the water on the right to hold the landscape together, even as this big path comes through it. And you can see how these loose groupings become part of a landscape. Here's the gardener, Isabel, talking with an older guy, and I'd seen them talking there multiple times about the plants. You can see the layering of the landscape. You can see the runnels towards the wetland. I don't know if you see my pointer. And then you can see the layering of how the cars are made less of a dominant presence in relation to the activity of the park. So is my time? Am I done? Have I used up my time?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So another thing that we did is we lowered the bench height to 14 inches. A standard would be 18 inches to strengthen the relationship between the seating and the ground so that they could become a topography together. And of course, the seating becomes ground when it turns into sitting steps. So that's the internal differentiation allows that to happen. And so in order to pull this off, to have the benches be part of a topography, it required close collaboration between me and MPA and Margie Ruddick of Wallace Roberts Todd, the landscape architect, to develop this project, you know, across many iterations, but with the idea, the concept's very clear. So here you can see in the construction, this thickening of the ground, constructing these city steps, making a topography where there have been a flat site. And then you see how the bench at the base of the sitting steps makes a transition from those steps to the main space in the JFK, not JFK, Dutch Kills Green, but how the steps become part of a landscape that holds this lush planting. Amanda Burden, Director of City Planning, wanted the Dutch Kills Green to be a refuge, an oasis. And so the idea of that, you can see, of course, with the continuous presence of the elevated trains with their noise and so on, that somehow it is also a refuge or an oasis, paradoxically. And people really love climbing up the stairs to then go down. What really makes the seating and the ground work, but of course, when we started conceptualizing the idea that they could play multiple roles and perform multiple roles, we didn't know that we would be able to leverage those capacities with the work of the with public art, the work of artist Michael Singer. But we were able to work out, because we had these pretty strong concepts, that Michael Singer would design, would make artistically these precast elements that are all surfaces, but they're surfaces that are part of the seats. You can see on the left, lower left, part of the paving. You can see on the right, and then part of stormwater management. You see what's called a runnel on the lower right, sorry. And you can see how the pavers are designed to make a space for planting. So the pavers become a planter, a water management apparatus, a place to sit. And they introduce an intensity and delicacy and fine grain to the different portions of the site where they're used sparingly. This is a work of Michael Singer, where he is showing earlier his involvement with water and with lightness. Here's other ones where, so we knew what he would be able to bring, and we wanted to be able to have it be something that could create also create areas of of lovely experience and the sense of texture and so on, and also engagement with nature with these relief elements that hold water and planting, but also to use them sparingly to be able to create consistency across this extremely long and fragmented site. And so this is the runnel, and gets at the idea of the stormwater management, integrating stormwater management in the artistic program. The hydrological systems of the site presented a number of problems in addition to stormwater management, but the runnels are part of a design solution that integrates these processes. The combination of the proximity of the seat to the ground and the fine grain of surfaces brings the language of the ground plane into relief. So the project extends the role and the reach of public art across the site by integrating it into the site system. But here's one of the pieces, and you see the amazing textures, and then you can see that same textures in the site at one of the benches when it's newly planted before it gets, planting in it. And here, seeing it to upper left corner of lower left, you can see how the ground becomes a planter. You know, that the artists and us have designed a joint to be able to use the paving to integrate planting. And then you see on the right one of the intimate sitting areas that is made by this assemblage of planting, of special paving, special cladding, and cladding at the benches. All the benches had the cladding. The paving, like I said, was used in the smaller amounts, but always with the benches, and then with Hanover pavers at either end. Here's a construction view showing the runnel, and this space at the left is what would become the subsurface wetland that is there to absorb the storm water. You can see the sitting steps to the right. And this is approximately the view we were looking at the beginning of my portion of the presentation that showed the sea of asphalt. This is a really lousy quality slide, but I show it to talk about the constructing the site as a landscape, in the sense that there are no boundaries, that there's a continuity in all directions that the eye can travel. And it's that continuity that's made possible by these granular interrelations that allows to create consistency across the fragmented site with full acceptance of the multiple industrial and post-industrial operations of that site. So this is where I'm segueing back to Sandro. And the idea that when you alter a site, you make sense of its materials in new ways, but you don't really add things. The project's integrated approach to diverse urban components and systems made it possible to construct an environment that is consistent and memorable and operative and economical. And so I pass it back to Sandro.
Thank you, Linda. Obviously, your description of the ground and the operations that we pursued in establishing essentially with this collaboration with Michael Singer, what are, in my words, moments of social intensification, moments that both in terms of the texture and in terms of the disposition of elements that Linda described, create along those different paths very different conditions, more secluded, for example, under the big trees, more sort of gradual, like in the panel that she showed, or borderline, maintaining the edge of the hill and opening up in cantilever towards the wetland and so forth. This articulation of the ground, as I said at the very beginning in our mind, is complemented by the attention for the inevitable presence of the elevated, but in other words, to introduce a layering as well within the structural engineering component of the site in order to define it as a space, in other words, take advantage of the fact that the elevated makes a curve, but also you will see in terms of somehow lessening the effect that the historical layering of this infrastructure is still causing insofar as there are multiple tracks operating at multiple levels. To go back to a vision of the extent of the elevated subway, which relates, as I said earlier on, with the construction of the Queensborough Bridge, which, by the way, in itself was a big engineering feat in terms of being built in double cantilever from the rock emergence of what is called Roosevelt Island in the middle of the East River, eventually then reaching the two ends. But then over the years, not only supporting the trolleys as it was at the beginning in 1909, but being complemented by more and more layers of infrastructure and construction on the elevated that you see basically correspond to the whole extent of the site. This is an image of 1915 when the construction of the elevated began. This is precisely at the corner where the two directions that are now active separate and go either to different directions of Queens towards the north and towards the east. This was the original station that already acknowledged the fact that there were two levels because the direction of the subways had somehow the possibility of creating an interchange, and that's what Linda called affordances. Right now there is also an underground subway, of course, but already at the time there was this challenge of creating a double-tiered station, let alone the first level reaching out from the sidewalk and having the station underneath the tracks themselves. Now, what happened is that over time, and you see an image here of the late 1920s, an incredible number of tracks were built. You see the station and the platforms on the left side. You see, therefore, here the extension of further tracks that cover essentially the north portion of what is now part of the median that we have worked on. But this particular condition had nevertheless some aspects of interesting regularity, notwithstanding the layering of mass that is there, which nevertheless, I mean, we wanted to engage. And you see, especially on the lower floor plan, the fact that there is a certain regularity in the module of the elevated. And it is, in fact, the way in which most elevated then are built throughout the city, which are based on an alternation between a module that is reinforced by cross trusses and a module where the beam itself supporting the tracks spans in between those 50 feet. So we studied quite closely, of course, the engineering of the elevated, which, as you can see, was made by reinforcing the steel flats with angles and rivets, and therefore has a challenge over time, since by now is more than 100 years old in many portions, and a challenge of maintenance on the part of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. So as we work different schemes on how to engage the elevated, you see here a phase in which we thought we were clipping directly the screens that constitute our intervention. Our intervention is very minimal. Again, how to use minimal interventions to effect significant change on a urban presence that could be otherwise completely overwhelming. In this case, we were exploring clipping on the structure. We wanted to verify, confirm that that would not create a problem with the existing structure that's there, and also because of its proximity to the trusses and the cross bracing, be, as you see in the images at the bottom, installed essentially on tracks, top and bottom, in order to facilitate maintenance, which is, of course, as I said earlier on, a major concern on the part of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. The final version instead relies on independent structural supports, and in this phase we were calling the elements butterflies, because all of a sudden they had gained their freedom somehow inhabiting the spaces that the elevated creates in terms of the regularity, but also the deformation of its modules. And in fact, here you see one condition at a curve where the module has become a triangle, and therefore the elements is sitting in the middle of that, stretching out in order to create the visual perception of the trusses being filled up and the space being filled up. Eventually, we transition to calling these the rooms, insofar as it is clear that by intervening in the areas where the trusses converge, we were acknowledging their architectural spatial characteristics, not only their sort of role in supporting the tracks. There are other conditions in which the structure reaches the sidewalk, and we thought that that would offer the opportunity for one of the two media screens, as we call them, that could be obviously installed with LED and become a source of orientation, but also eventually of income for the Metropolitan Transit Authority and program. And you see here the presence of the moving image, the Museum of the Moving Image, which is one of the many cultural institutions actually that surround Queen's Plaza, but they're fairly dispersed. So we had their support in terms of using at least one or of these two media screens, and this is the other one, abutting directly the central space, as you see in the plan on the upper left. And you see here, the mentioning of PS1, which is, just a few blocks down on Jackson Avenue. So the idea that this installation could also include moments of cultural diffusion for this surrounding cultural institution seemed to be something of significance. The other aspect that came out from the layering of the historical infrastructure and all the different positions of the tracks is that some of them from the late 20s were eventually demolished, and therefore there has been a reduction of the width of the overall somehow structure. But at the same time, there were other portions that were so integral with the remaining structure that would not be demolished, like in the case of a number of lower tracks that cross Jackson Avenue and make that intersection particularly dark and particularly threatening and very disorienting. So in a way, this exercise, which is in a way very simple because it takes advantage of the configuration of the beams and install LED lighting and a simple stainless steel mesh. The general project, in fact, is a project of very low capital cost. The issue that is still being resolved is the issue of maintenance also, because the issue of maintenance needs to be coordinated between the Department of Traffic that owns and controls the land and the Metropolitan Transit Authority. And as you probably know from newspapers and the story that has been going on by now for many years, there has been a level of tension at the level of the political administrations between state and city, and that complicates the fact of reaching an agreement in terms of how to address the maintenance of this particular proposal. It is a way, in terms of what Linda said, of facilitating the connection between the north and the south side of Queen's Plaza across and under the elevated, as this image of the early 20th century wanted to portray. And in fact, the goal is precisely that, and especially in the case of this transformation of beams into lines of light. The process is a complex process, as I said, and in part because we believe that the use of technology for representation, that is video, is a different way to engage the multiplicity of actors without necessarily having to bring everybody in a room for half an hour in a PowerPoint, and therefore stimulating a level of conversation that is necessary in order to, in a way, reconstruct a constituency for the implementation of this vision. And the last thing that I'm going to show you is a video that somehow summarized the strategy of the elevated, and it is called From Dark to Light, Queen's Plaza From Dark to Light, and it is the one that, in fact, has been gathering over the years. I mean, and it's a very long process. I mean, the video was made when we were finishing the ground, so by now It has been around for a few years. At this point, with the hyper development that in fact has taken place, the kind of constituencies exceed the institutions and the public agencies, because there is a great interest at this point to make the ground level of all this real estate investment, as Linda said, attract and support that kind of street level activities that is essential in creating a notion of urbanity. So let me go to the final video. That is going to be a 4 minutes video with sound, so that I will totally stop talking at this point.
In the heart of Long Island City, 1.5 miles of new bike trails and landscape will connect the East River to a new Queens Plaza. This video presents the conceptual design for the existing elevated structure, which will redefine a space long dominated by noisy traffic lanes and elevated tracks as an urban destination, alongside new development already underway. Phase 1 is transforming a sea of asphalt into JFK Park, a verdant pedestrian refuge.
Major makeover for Queens Plaza, creating a green gateway into Long Island City.
Right here where we are sitting, we will not have these cars here. We will have a canopy of gorgeous trees.
At the ground level, vegetation, artist-designed paving, and social seating create a textured pedestrian realm, which also enables stormwater filtration. The proposal harnesses the powerful presence of the elevated subway structure, with 3 kinds of minimal interventions, reinventing it from a tangle of steel into a wayfinding icon. The rooms are a series of glowing lanterns, brightening the trusses that support the tracks without interfering with their maintenance. The light lines turn abandoned beams at the lower level into a well-lit urban canopy for pedestrians and drivers. Where the elevated meets park and sidewalk, programmable media screens provide information about Long Island City and opportunities for art and revenue. Let's take a look at how subway riders, cyclists, and pedestrians will experience these interventions. Exiting the elevated at the Queensboro Plaza station, passengers will see the glowing rooms leading pedestrians and cyclists towards the new JFK Park. New planted medians offer protected passage for pedestrians and cyclists. The elevated structure design project also clarifies the approach to Queens Plaza from Jackson Avenue. The intersection between Jackson Avenue and Queens Boulevard appears particularly chaotic and dark. The glowing steel mesh of the light lines will orient drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians across the busy intersection. Lit from within, the light lines will announce subway passages overhead. Below the Jackson Avenue intersection is the concourse of Queens Plaza subway station, from which riders emerge to encounter the overwhelming presence of the elevated on Queens Plaza South. Here, Phase 1 of the Gotham Center development is under construction. The new 21-story office tower will face the elevated structure. One of the 2 media screens will contribute to the identity of the surrounding community, providing information about life in Long Island City, celebrating Queens Plaza as a unique post-industrial metropolitan gateway and exemplary 21st century park. The goal of the elevated structure design proposal is to fulfill the vision of the overall Queens Plaza project, integrating the new roadways, landscape elements, and pedestrian spaces with historical metropolitan infrastructure. The proposed 3 kinds of interventions, the rooms, the light lines, and the media screens, will bring to Long Island City the excitement of Times Square and the green spaces of Central Park in a single place, both active and welcoming. They celebrate Queens Plaza's historical legacy with maximum effect on public space.
Thank you very much. I think that we can open it for question. I'll move it again so that we're both in here. And
thank you very much, Sandro and Linda. It's a very complex and paradigmatic project, this of Queen's Plaza, practically unifying many items from the social problem, which is really important to the structural engineering aspects, to the vegetation and landscape problems, to the urban, of course, problems. And so it's really paradigmatic, I think. I am sure that there are some questions from the audience. I just ask a thing, which is in reality, which has an answer from your speech. How influenced, in particularly in the case of you, Sandro, the approach to the landscape problems, particularly in this case, and the collaboration with Linda, changing in a way your mentality, your approach as an architect, because this I think is a personal story of you. And of course, it would be nice to compare with other projects I know of your firm, but I think this collaboration and this approach to the problem of landscape has, in a way, reinforced and facilitated a sort of change, which probably was an attitude you had before, but I'm curious to reconstruct this fragment of your plan.
Thank you, Renato. It's a very challenging question, of course, coming from you, but coming from you already suggests me a way in this conversation, which is I think that the reflection on the role of architecture that basically the 60s and 70s as being brought into the picture by environmental art, or what Rosalind Krauss called sculpture in the expanded field, raised a fundamental challenge to a condition that architecture inevitably converges towards, which is to build objects. At the same time, the repositioning of objects in a larger context, and to a certain degree, the dissolution of projects from their self-contained identity, which gets to lean either towards the formalist monumental or a certain level of more self-involved, so to speak, linguistic investigations. That particular challenge, I think, found in a number of different approaches significant support. So on the one hand, you could say what Rosalind Krauss defined as site markings, say the work of Richard Long, and in other instances, what she called site construction, for example, the work of Mary Miss, which I didn't show here because I just wanted to show one of her photo drawings, which nevertheless precisely identifies ways to intensify the experience of a site. That way of using collage in order to, in that case, accentuate the pull of the well in Egypt is one way of expressing that level of visceral and therefore psychological engagement that I think architecture can pursue. So in a way, this opening up beyond the notion of object allowed to do some level of reflection. And I have to say, we're being very lucky in a number of public projects to work with incredible artists. And in this case, I think the collaboration with Michael Singer was particularly productive along the lines of Linda's commitment to thickening the ground in order to be able to withstand the pressure that the elevated would cause, and therefore creating those social spaces. So my contribution in that process was to push Michael towards understanding how to make the precast pieces that eventually became part of the benches beyond the more flat elements that he would organize. But in general, again, in terms of the strategy of critique of the object, is to diffuse his work as opposed to concentrate it and make it part of the site.
There's a question from Pippo Ciorra. We can listen to him.
No, dobbiamo leggerla.
Is written. Ciao Linda, ciao Sandro. Do you think that today in the architecture debate there still is the same energy and focus on the topic of the design of public as there was when you started the Queen Plaza projects?
Linda.
It's hard to know what would be in the minds of our peers or the culture at large, because there are so many cultures. I think in our work, our approach is the same, and that it's a constant kind of re-understanding and further articulation of the tenets of what would be involved in, bridging between the world we live in and the world we make. And I think in terms of the questions of the issues of climate change, issues of equity, that all of these require an approach that isn't siloed into separate disciplines, an approach that, as I was saying, that really requires acknowledging the small as well as the big, acknowledging that everything matters, and then requiring at the same time an articulated site systems approach, but also an attention to the granular. I don't see that I'm answering your question.
Well, if I may say, I would like to say yes, if indeed the urban scale and the landscape set of issues, the so-called culture and nature historical juxtapositions, are allowed to converge towards a new notion of architecture. And so obviously, having gone through a neoliberal phase of market-driven, consumption of images in architecture, one could be a little bit skeptical. However, the emergence of both a level of concern for social equity and the inevitable pressure of environmental challenges, I think, could inform, if somehow redirected to a challenge to the conventional notion of architecture, the possibility of finding new energies because of the urgency of these two scales, the urban and the landscape, culture and nature that we need to leave behind as a Western ontology.
And the social.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, people.
Is there any question, further question? from the public? I saw Nicolò.
I have a comment.
There's Aldo Imonino. Okay.
He's a public.
Ciao Linda, ciao Sandro. Congratulations for your lecture, very interesting. I think that it gives very clearly both the mental and the building process, which is behind let me say a perception. I think I'm one of the record men of Queen Plaza, because I spent there 3 weeks, because for 3 years I was for 1 week in hotel with my students exactly on the Queen Plaza. So it's a place that I know quite well. And let me say that first of all, it's a perfect project of unvolumetric architecture. It's exactly what I think when I try to establish a new, not a new category, but a new term, that it's with few, let me say, with the not few, because in Linda and Sandro project there are no few acts. There are a lot of acts, but at the end you have the impression of a whole, which it's really, let me say, minimal, natural, and friendly. So it's a very strong result. It's again with the few elements, not few acts, but few elements. They change completely the perception of the place. And also using in the most advanced ideas of landscape, that brings a sort of, again, naturality, even if it's totally controlled. The orography and the topography and the elements of the project are very well balanced. Let me say that I think that at the end of my comment, I can what it really come back to my mind. It's a fantastic quotation by Henri Matisse, that at the end of his life said that I want that my paintings act like the spring that never reveal the effort that it costs. That's it. Bravi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo.
Thank you, Aldo. That's Nicolò Zanatta, I think, has something to say.
I just, if nobody else has any questions, quindi se nessun altro ha delle domande, I have to ask to our guests 5 seconds to, more like a couple of minutes, to do this interview that was tasked to me by the Stowe Foundation. So if anybody else has any questions.
I could ask something probably quick, if you can hear me.
Sure.
Thanks for the presentation, Nicola. That's a very interesting project, and I wanted to ask you. You already talked a bit about the relationship with your challenging the idea of master planning and the relationship with the public bodies. So the transportation cooperation in the city. But I wanted to ask you, how easy or how useful was it to use the categories of flows and apparatuses to convey your project ideas? And how easy was it to connect this with the practical and, so to say, concrete project, and to transmit, to explain your ideas to the public bodies you were working with? If you think.
Well, I think it really worked. I mean, let's say Linda mentioned RFP. To give you an idea, we were at some point selected with two other firms. One who presented a fairly conventional master plan, and another that was much more focused on introducing architectural objects. We came in and we said, as you saw, due to the extension and complexity of the site, we can offer a way of constructing narratives, essentially. And in fact, what I showed was one of the three scenarios, so to speak, which was, called, the sort of the environmental flow scenario, as opposed to another one that was called the beach, and another one that was called the forest, where therefore the emphasis on different components, these different performative apparatuses, would in fact set up different tones or different registers of engaging the complexity of the site. And actually, it was very productive in terms of the interface, for example, with the Department of City Planning. Amanda Burden in one of the meetings said, "Oh, fantastic, you're allowing me to go shopping." I mean, so the idea that, instead of being features, like, the marble whirlpool in a house, which is sort of a real estate stupidity, but it actually works, or the super fridge or something like that. I mean, these in fact are engaging the flows, so they really work as apparatuses, and therefore they do more than being objects.
But I think you're asking something about what kind of language we would use to communicate what were the capacities of the project to these public agencies. And it wasn't easy. There was nothing easy about this project. I think we weren't using the terminology around the environmental apparatus. And I think because we were working in a way that enabled each element in the site to perform multiple roles, part of that was because we were always responding to functional necessity. We were always, when we designed the benches, they were meeting a criteria for how many seats there should be in the park, how many seats that should be facing each other in the way of Amanda Burden wanted to have social seating. That there were criteria for a lot of things, and I think that so much of the functionality was driving the project. Certainly the steel-sided berms, which have a tremendous presence and are kind of almost sublime, they really were necessary to be able to buffer the traffic and to protect pedestrians and cyclists from being killed. I mean, seriously. So they were answering functional necessities. And so much of the time, DOT, Department of Transportation, wasn't one entity. It was 4 or 5 or 6, because it was DOT buses, DOT sidewalk, streets, so on. And we would be in a room, with like 4 different representatives from DOT and, 3 from MTA and, 2 from Department of Parks and Recreation, and then, all these other entities, and then all the engineers of the project and so on. So I think that really a lot of the time it's about getting the drawings to be able, or models, we really had to make models to be able to be used as communication tools so that we enable people to visualize the transformation. But frankly, engaging the public art in the seating and paving was the way that we didn't lose it. in the process of what's called here value engineering, and maybe it's called that there, when there needs to be cost cutting. That because it was art, it couldn't be cut. And so that's actually what enabled the project in its integrity, at least the first phase of its realization, to be built. And there's a project around the corner on Jackson Ave that has the same program: seating, lighting, planting, median, bike path, and it's entirely normative. You know, each thing is discrete, and our project didn't cost any more. You know, but it makes a complete environment, or an environment in a way that the Jackson Avenue project.
Yeah, just a little gloss. I mean, as I show in the diagrams of the dynamics between agencies, the Department of Parks came in relatively at the end in more heavy ways through the lens of maintenance. And they were the ones that said, we want to use our standard benches. And, you know, it was a way for them to have the item that they know to perform what they do in all the other parks or in Jackson Avenue. And, you know, and I think that, as I was saying earlier, I mean, that level of integration in this case with an environmental artist completely saved the project, at least in terms of the benches. So
that and the leadership of Amanda Burden.
Of course. I mean,
who stuck by and stood up for the art being significant.
Yeah, and also because she totally understood the fact that instead of being objects like benches or whatever not, they were, you know, these elements that were performing more than one thing at the same time, which had been composed in this sort of score to actually produce an effect.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there other questions, or we can conclude with the interview of Nicolas? I don't see any request. I think Nicolas, you can ask if you like to have this little interview for the Stowe Foundation also. But before I want to thank you very much, Linda and Sandro, and I hope we have good news from the States in the next days. And so the revolution of Queen's Plaza, I hope may be also a revolution for the political situation in the States.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed, indeed. Okay.
Nicola.
Renato. Thank you, Renato.
Thank you all.
And yes, I think it
okay, what are these questions? Now I'm nervous.
Thank you very much. And don't worry, it's just a very small, very brief interview. I will just be flashing a couple of questions on the screen. It's sort of a presentation of your studio, of who you are, and just the acknowledgement of this kind of event that the Stowe Foundation has been organizing for quite some years, so far. Okay.
Yeah.
Ready. Go.
Okay. So. If you could just, yeah.
That's good. I mean, good enough I spoke about ontology. I mean, go ahead.
Okay, well, Marpillero, Pollak Architects, we founded our firm together in 1998. So we had the firm's 20th birthday a couple of years ago. It was a great event. We're both teachers. Sandro's teaching at Columbia and at Iuav. I'm teaching at Cooper Union. We both come as architects to collaborate together, bringing with us Sandro, bringing the urban bringing surrealism, bringing his understanding of engineering, lighting, you know, me coming, bringing my ontology, you know, me coming, bringing my understanding of landscape, my sense of, you know, working at a very fine grain with programmatic social aspects, that, you know, my interest in geography, that, you know, neither of us is a very good marketer or anything like that, but we are bringing our internally differentiated identities into relation with each other.
Yeah, I mean, what I said earlier could be already said, but you could say, you know, the sort of the social and the environmental, the city and the landscape somehow converge towards architecture, and the architecture that comes out of that is a different notion of architecture that is precisely this hybridization of what otherwise would be defined practices.
And you can see, of course, that I'm kind of working at the level of the ground, and Sandro's kind of working in the air. You know, always with the cantilever, you know, in other projects too, that we do have these focuses that are, each set of our focuses is an array that's interrelated, and then we're complementing each other's focuses and our collaborators.
Okay. What is your studio's philosophy? Well, I mean, yeah, I think part of it was just explained by you, but you want to flesh it out more?
Linda has a word which is called integration, which I don't totally subscribe to, as many things that go on between the two of us, since we come in from different points of view. But, you know, you could say is integration and, you know, a positive role of complexity.
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as it's not an easy time, it's an incredibly productive time, because I think the layers of understanding that one can have as through practice and through bumping your nose against so unable to evolve a philosophy, you know, and theories that are entirely interrelated with practice and with the world.
Okay, and lastly, if you would like to acknowledge the Stowe Foundation initiative and what you think about this kind of events.
I think we're thrilled to be able to participate, and we're looking forward to the other lectures in the series. I think that the introduction and reading the landscape brief, and I think Renato's question about how Queen's Plaza experience might have changed, altered Sandro's perceptions of as an architect. I think it's a wonderful thing. It's very important, especially now where here we all are in our. Well, we're lucky to be in the same space, of course, but I think that it's a time, you know, where we have to make good on the promises of community and activity, and that this is, I think that the way that Renato has worked, I know I've worked to develop this set of lectures as its own kind of cultural sphere that will be evolving across this month of November, that it's, you know, it's a pleasure to be able to kick it off.
Well, I mean, I think that this initiative of the Stowe Foundation is very interesting, and I think that, you know, the publication that Renato introduced about the array of positions that got to be expressed last year is a good indication of its value. And, you know, as Linda said, we're very honored to be part of this, and we know, because we know intimately quite a number of the other speakers of this November series, that you know, it's going to be a thematically focused and therefore substantial contribution on the part of the Stowe Foundation to be able to support this kind of initiatives. So thank you very much.
Are we going out to dinner now?
Yeah, you're free to go. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you so much, and well, have a good night.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
And have a good
Bella
day.
camicia, Sandro, come al solito.
Siamo stati in India, Aldo, come te, quando eri giovane.
Passiamo agli Amarcord. Bene, grazie a tutti. Speriamo che le prossime volte funzionerà meglio il nostro collegamento, ma mi pare che alla fine, insomma, qualcosa siamo riusciti a fare. Lavorare in virtuale non è così semplice, ma ci proviamo. Ok, speriamo che vengano tempi migliori. Addio e a presto. Ciao ciao. Ciao ciao. Saluto a tutti gli ospiti e al prossimo appuntamento, che vi ricordo sarà martedì della settimana prossima con Iñaki Ábalos e Renata Senkiewicz. Altra coppia interessante.
Ciao.
Certamente, sono bravissimi.
Ciao ciao.